This is Rogers TV.
Skylar Franke is a new councillor from Ward 11, which is my neck of the woods. She's got a rich background in a number of different things, but especially in the environment, which I find really interesting. Different politicians have different agendas, right? So you can meet with them all and they all agree with you, but then they put it up against their own agendas and it's something totally different. Have you found that, or have you been able to get around that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely slower than I'm used to. Having worked in the nonprofit sector, you have very limited resources and you just make it work and you try to figure something out. And maybe it doesn't always go perfectly, but you're always trying something new. I find, of course, working in a very large corporation through policy to be slower, but in a way it's almost more thoughtful. You have a lot more time to talk to other stakeholders and to try and make sure your policy that you're presenting is going to pass, and so you spend a lot more time making it really good. So I do enjoy that aspect, but it is much slower. I think anyone would agree with us. And then, yeah, I mean, I find it interesting. Again, I think everyone has their own perspective, and everyone has their own goals, and it's where you can find alignment that I've been finding success. So specifically, I sit on planning, and one of the more recent motions was about green development standards, trying to make sure that the buildings we build now are going to be energy efficient and more sustainable, and trying to figure out what aspects of those have meaning for developers and for other members of council. And so, I mean, some people call it compromise. So you're trying to find, something that makes everybody happy. At the same time, I think you're trying to find a way for everyone to buy into the policy. So I do find that a bit difficult because, of course, if I wrote it, it would be very different than if it was just Skylar Franke's ideal scenario versus, let's work together and try to find something that everyone can at least move forward on. I do find that hard, but I think at this point, it's part of the process, I think.
But I think also on the local area, I think you probably have, you see through things through a very clear lens when it comes to climate change. How do you feel about the speed of it and how it's going for how we're handling it in London?
I don't think London is going fast enough, and I say it all the time. I don't think we're not meeting our targets. We've made our own targets, or we're not meeting them. So that is incredibly frustrating. And I think to me, that's why I'm really passionate both about mitigation, so trying to reduce emissions, and then adaptation, because I think we can mitigate the best we can, and that's, of course, trying to reduce emissions from cars and houses and buildings. In absence of doing that to the full extent that we need to do to actually stop warming, how are we going to survive in a society that has extreme heat, extreme cold, flooding, drought? And that is where I think actually I come to be much more passionate about food security. Because I do worry about, eventually we're going to run out of fossil fuels, and our entire food system is mostly based on import and export. Yeah. So what are people going to eat? And that's why I think food security is incredibly important at every municipal level, and people should be able to provide food for themselves and for their families within their city limits as much as they can. But yeah, the pace is not going fast enough. I think everyone would agree with that.
So let's talk about two different venues. I was in one recently with a number of citizens who were coming together, who were trying to give input into the budget on environmental concerns. And they had put out a whole list of things that they were concerned about or things that they felt get dealt with. One of those things was the Climate Emergency Action Plan in the city. And so, I went through the different rounds of it, and I always put that as number one. And I gave it the highest recommendation that I could. But when it all came together at the end of all of that time, and they added them all up and put them by priority by everybody that was there, it never made the list. And I found that so interesting because they were into things like community gardens, for instance, or things like transit and those kind of things. But that one, for some reason, did not register with those people who are very concerned and very dedicated about the environment. Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because that's kind of nebulous out there, or do they not see it as effective or deep enough? What do you think?
Yeah, I think because having worked in the sector for a while, people struggle to conceptualize climate change. So like 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions, I can't even picture that, And so they actually have people who've done demonstratable art projects, which shows you what 1 ton looks like. A red balloon, this is 1 ton. So I think it's hard for people to grasp, and it's invisible in a way. Like you don't really see it until all of a sudden maybe your house is flooded because there's, extreme rain for 2 weeks. And then you're like, oh, this is climate change. Okay, here we go. So I think it's hard for people to see it as a very immediate issue, even though it is, unless there's a wildfire around their house or flood. So I think a lot of people pick things that are visible. Community gardens, very visible. Transit, very visible. Of course, I think they're both wonderful and part of the solution. Yeah. But I think, again, having a very full scope response, which is what our climate emergency action plan is. There's 10 work plans in different sectors. I think it's harder for people to grasp. And sometimes people get overwhelmed by the concept. And that's why I really do think every small bit we can do and every success we have helps compel people to move forward. So. Yes,
and this is where it crosses over to food. I was looking at the city website this morning about the Climate Emergency Action Plan. They have a little 2-minute cartoon kind of video about the Climate Emergency Action Plan. I just wanted to play you one small section of it that's 30 seconds and get your opinion on it.
Because of these changes in climate, lots of plants and animals won't be able to adapt to the new environment, reducing the biodiversity we rely on. Plus, some foods will be less available, and food on the whole will get more expensive. So climate change in London means higher costs, more frequent severe weather events, and harm to our residents, while reducing biodiversity and the availability of many of our favorite foods. All these issues are even more harmful for those in our city who deserve equitable access to resources. And things will only get more difficult for all of us if we don't take strong collective actions.
So there it is. I mean, it's recognized, I think, by the city, the importance of this, not only about food and other things, but also about equity around food, making sure that it's accessible for all and affordable for all. But I have been looking through the budget, and I know now it's a big budget time. And I think, is this the first year where the mayor kind of pitches his own budget because of the superheroes category that the province gave him? So you'll have these different budgets floating around. And yet, as I've looked at these budgets, hardly anything in it about food security. And yet it makes it in the video about that's part of the Climate Emergency Action Plan that the city is very interested in. Or last night, when I was looking through all that stuff about the environmental stuff and the Climate Emergency Action Plan didn't make the cut. It seems to me that we understand those larger issues and know that they are there and that they are pressing. But we get so focused on the little things that we feel that we can act upon, that we often get distracted away from the bigger things. I really think that's happening around food security. I was delighted when you wrote and asked for a meeting, and we did, but that just doesn't happen even to other groups, food security. But this is, City Hall, I know, is very aware of it, and the same way as many of us are very much aware of the environment. So I do worry, to be honest with you, that it's going to be hard to find food security if it's barely in the budget. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be hard to focus on the Climate Emergency Action Plan if it doesn't make the cut. What can we do about that? Like, I just think something needs to happen to get people to raise their sights and realize the seriousness of the situation. I'd be interested in your views, Skylar.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, right now, I think emailing your city councillor or the mayor, because he'll be tabling his budget at the end of January, asking him to fund the Climate Emergency Action Plan, asking him to pick other environmental business cases like transit and the community gardens. And you're right, there's barely a mention of food security, both in our strat plan and in the budget. And what we fund in the budget is where our priorities are. We have a very large strat plan, and we talked about it during the process. We're not going to be able to do everything in it because we kind of made the scope too broad. and what we actually pick in the budget will be really what we care about. So I think right now putting political and public pressure on politicians saying, hey, you said, you declared a climate emergency in 2019, you made a plan in 2021. Are you going to pay for it? Because you literally have added one new climate change staff in 5 years, and that's not an emergency response at all. Yeah. And then to food security, I think you're right. We don't have a strategy. We don't have a plan. And I was chatting with some people from the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council, and even one of the recommendations was to have an emergency food plan. So again, if we're in the same boat as COVID, how does everyone get their food? And what if that is more than 3 or 4 days? What if that is weeks? Yeah. How are we feeding Londoners? So I think that highlights a gap that the city needs to respond to, which is to develop strategies to deal with food security issues.
Yes, I mean, I fear that these issues are big, but people just can't see the forest for the trees, if you know what I mean. I mean, there's just so many things going on around us, and we all try to take things at the level that we're at and try to make a difference to citizens and do what we can. But if it doesn't make it into these larger policy areas or economic budget issues, it's just not going to make the grade. I worry about that we won't be well enough prepared as communities. And I know that for you have been worried about, like, we're surrounded by such great farmland. And we know that and the food bank works a lot with the farmers, and also as part of the Feed Ontario, which is all the food banks of Ontario. We have these ongoing negotiations with farmers who've been so generous to us. But one of the things that they keep bringing up, Skylar, is this losing of productive farmland around the larger communities, especially as urban sprawl continues to go out. This is even though we've heard about this for 2 decades. And I know that you're very serious about that, and you want that looked at and dealt with. So I just want to give you a bit of a soapbox here and just tell us why that motivates you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. We've actually debated it, even though it's never been on the agenda at council multiple times because it comes up. I sit on planning, and right now we have staff doing a land needs assessment, which is looking at, how much land do we have in the City of London in our urban growth boundary? How much of it is kind of pre-allocated for residential development? How much of it needs to stay as ecological, secure areas? So we've got that. And they're looking at it to see if we need to expand. And I'm worried, and we'll see, it depends what we get back in March, but I'm worried there's going to be a really strong push from the development community and from specific councillors to expand our growth boundaries to allow for more residential development on prime agricultural land. And as we know, southwestern Ontario is essentially the breadbasket of Ontario. It's where we get most of our local food from. And anytime we have a new residential subdivision or development that takes over, you don't get that farmland back. You can't knock down all the houses and then put on, a field of wheat or something later on. So it's really incredibly important that we build inwards and upwards, that we follow the London Plan, and that we protect all of this agriculture around us. And that's also actually the cheapest way that we can build. So right now, London is pretty sprawled. And of course, with low density, it means people's property taxes are higher because there's less people paying for the services. So when people complain about property taxes, I hope that they also support denser neighborhoods with infill and medium and high density buildings, because that's one of the cheapest ways we can reduce their tax levy. So there's lots of benefits to not sprawl. And I think we need to keep our eye on it this year as we start to get some of those reports back from staff.
Yeah, and one of the things that concerns me is a number of years ago, I worked with Western Fair to do a white paper on the farmers around this area and how they feel about food. This also made it into the food assessment that was done a short while later. And even before this sprawl that we're worried about gets even worse, the farmers in the area are having great difficulty at getting their food into London. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have difficulty going up the 401 to the terminal in Mississauga and go out to the world. I think that's interesting. But I think that farmers are watching their own future be threatened by sprawl, which is legitimate. But they're also economically having trouble surviving on the smaller farms or medium-sized farms because they can't get the markets in where the people are at. It's just very difficult. And it seems to me that's why policies are so important. Policies are supposed to be able to see down into the future and see what is coming and prepare our legislation and other things to kind of match that and meet those challenges. But it seems to me that if what we do is we tackle the sprawl issue, but don't tackle the market issue for our farmers to be able to send their stuff, it won't really matter in the sense they'll go under anyway. Not because their food isn't good or they don't work hard enough, but because the venues for them to sell their stuff is not, as much as we want local food, they want to give food locally. I have great difficulty doing it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's never made sense to me why I go to the grocery store and the food is from this area, but it went to Toronto, went to a food terminal, and then was trucked back here. I've never really understood it. I understand there's like supply chain programs and cost for volume, but it doesn't actually make that much logical sense. So I would say I definitely would like to see farmers being able to bring their food to market wherever is closest to them. And I think that, yeah, I agree. I completely agree. We need to have some way to address what my understanding is there's a lot of, younger generations that are not taking over the farming business. And so we're actually seeing more consolidation, more large corporation kind of farming practices. And just less people getting engaged in that as their career. So I think that requires a lot of policies. We talk all the time about how we need to get more people into trades, we need to get more people into nursing, and so there's programs the government does to incentivize that work. So I would love to see programs where the government, maybe helps pay for training for farming or pays for land, something that makes it more financially viable for people to take as a career option.
Yeah. I know, I think, is it staff at the city that are preparing the land's need assessment? Is that correct? And that comes in, is it next month or the month? March, is it?
March.
Right. Does that deal with some of this?
No, that's really specifically just looking at how much land do we have available in London for development. Really, that's the whole scope. So
the idea of rural lands maybe being available for development, but they're not zoned that way yet, that doesn't fit into that?
Not necessarily, unless they're within London's boundaries. We don't look at anything outside. But the thing is with London, we've got boundaries that go all the way south almost to St. Thomas, but we have an urban growth boundary that kind of cuts us off just near the highway. I see. So the idea is if we expanded, we'd likely go down towards St. Thomas.
Yeah, understood. I know one of the things that you've been trying to do about addressing food security is, I know you're a big believer in community gardens. Right. And I know London already has some. I know they're well supported by citizens who love the whole idea of growing and other things. But I also know that you're trying to get some of that into the budget, the city budget. How does that look? What are those costs? And do you have a lot of support for that?
Yeah, so right now there's a budget case for 2 new community gardens in the city. So right now I think we have 16 or 17. And they're all fully subscribed, to my knowledge. Last year they had a waiting list, and every year my understanding is they have waiting lists. And so they want 2 new ones, and they also want to actually expand some of the existing ones, so add another 30 lots to areas that can accommodate that. So that costs about, my understanding is the capital is about $150, $180 per, because they've got to make sure that there's water, they have to, amend the soil, just make sure everything's set up for the gardeners. And then there's some operating, so city staff do go by in the summers and make sure everything's going well and maintained. So altogether, that's, about $352 for the capital, and then another, $68 for operating. I'm really hoping the mayor will actually just put it into his budget, because that's a lot easier through his strong mayor's powers. But if not, I will be on the floor trying to add it. I'm not sure how many other councillors are supportive, but for example, I know Councillor McAllister, who is Ward 1, he made sure in the strat plan that there was more community gardens specifically referenced. So I do know that is probably a priority for him. So we will see when we're debating budget how many other people really think that community gardens are a way that we can also start to address food security and insecurity in our neighborhoods.
Right, and that's a good way for citizens to get involved, is to write in and say, look, we really support that. Because lots of folks don't have the opportunity to grow where they live. So to have that community place they could come to is important.
Yeah, yeah. And I know staff, they look at areas with high density, high social risk, and then they survey the area to see, would you participate in community gardens? So they do pick strategically where they go.
Yeah, yeah. So in these last few minutes, Skylar, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it, I want to talk about policy. I always like to talk about that. And I know when you and I were speaking there a short while ago, we were talking about the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council. Right now, if you are, a politician in an area, if you are a company that's looking as to whether to establish something in the London area or whatever it is, you often want to come to kind of one place that's a clearinghouse for that stuff, that has like research, cost benefit analysis, legislation, all of those kind of things. And because I was there at the beginning of the Food Policy Council about a decade ago now, that was the real desire for it. And that it would kind of be a one-stop shop for everybody that was interested in food. And it wouldn't just be about London, it would be about Middlesex as well, and that harmony, and, or sometimes there could be tension that has to be resolved through those policy issues. But it seems to me that the Food Policy Council has struggled, not because of so much a lack of leadership, but a lack of support. There was a large number of groups that supported it financially to begin with. And then after COVID and everything else came, it's kind of gasping. It's trying to keep its head above water. And yet these big expectations are coming from it, right? I think that the Food Policy Council was meant to address those larger issues here and also regionally. And I guess I would really hope that more support comes for that, because I think what we want are these institutions that are kind of they transcend the normal hubbub of community life, and they exist much like legislation does. It exists at another level, and that impacts, what we can do in our lives. Have you felt that for yourself? I know that you're pretty big on the environmental side of things, but I know you're very sensitive to the food stuff. Do you see, and I'm just asking you this, but do you see the Food Policy Council as one of those vital tools that needs to be upgraded in order to deal with food security? And the second part of the question is, do you think that part of the reason why food security is not a major issue for a lot of different folks and organizations is because the Food Policy Council is not at that level where it's listened to and heard?
Yeah, I think the Food Policy Council has a vital role to play in trying to address food security in the city. I know I sat on the Urban Agriculture Steering Committee for a little bit back in 2017. The city got a consultant. They put together a smaller urban ag strategy. And at the time, they were able to devote 0.25 of a staff person to support it. And then it was based on a bunch of volunteers sitting around a table trying to implement it. And so I've had experience in the past where if it's not well supported, and if it doesn't have resources like either staff support or a budget to actually implement the work, it doesn't go very far. Even though the strategy was phenomenal, there was so much community input, the ideas were great, there's a lot of passion. Somebody's got to pay for it, and somebody has to make sure it happens. And so I think that that applies to pretty much anything, but including the Food Policy Council. So who's going to pay for it, and who's the long term going to make sure it happens? And a lot of the time, these strategies need some accountability. So, who's responsible? And that's why, like in our strat plan, we have specifically like what department has to make sure this happens, and what are the metrics we're evaluating them on. So. I think moving forward, resourcing the Food Policy Council will be important, and then just making sure there are tangible outcomes to succeed. So looking at the community food assessment, looking at the urban agriculture strategy, and saying, has this been completed? Were we successful? Did we accomplish this? And if not, why not? So I think that applies to almost anything, but I would love to see the Food Policy Council at the table more often, because I think food and water, it's pretty much what everyone needs. So you can't say that it's not an essential.
Yeah. At our board meeting in February, one of the things that's coming up is a vote to more heavily financially support the Food Policy Council. We do now. Right now, we're the financial managers of it to try to keep it going. But we have been trying to drum up support for it from some of the old partners, and it's having trouble gaining that kind of traction. So the food bank's going to invest more heavily in that, because it also affects how we operate as a food bank. The quality of food, where it comes from, all of those things are very important. However, I do think it's a bit of a dangerous thing when you have one group primarily that's the main funder of it. It needs to be diversified and accepted throughout the community as a really important tool for all of us. So it is my hope that I think with the city doing the food assessment and the food bank upping its commitment to the Food Policy Council, that's all wonderful. But it's going to need more, and we need to get others, even in the industry, the grocery industry and others, they all need to become part of that and to pursue it. And I think if that could happen, then it's my sense that both food policy and environmental issues around food would carry up much higher stature than they do now.
I would love to see kind of like the health and homelessness summits, where there are 3 summits, people from across sectors. There are 70 different organizations, 200 different people, all in a room talking about the same problem, and then all agreeing and committing to work together collaboratively on the solution. And it takes time, and that's really hard work. But I think that, to me, is where I'd love to see some of the work for the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council heading, because I think that when everyone's aware of it and everyone commits to working on the solution, that's where we see a lot of magic happen.
Yeah. But Skylar, that worked because the city took the lead. Right? And also, I think having a $25 million anonymous donor helped to kind of put fuel into that, so on and so forth. But these are the areas where I really feel personally, and I'm not trying to criticize anything or whatever, but I just feel that there's, we're out there, we're doing all that we can as citizens on the environmental thing or on food thing and many other things as well, democratic renewal, all of those things. And yet, we're trying to get the city to listen, or we try to get the province to listen, or we try to get the federal government to listen. And we're often not all that successful, and it's discouraging. But let the city step up and call partners in. And I think in this case, they're finding partners that are willing to fund the health and homeless strategy, that are willing to build units, that are willing to staff them well, the police willing to do proper security to keep neighborhoods safe. It really takes a city, I think, to be able to do that. So I really agree with you about the Food Policy Council, but I'm not sure that at the level that we're trying to work at now, we'll reach that until the city turns around and sees its reflection in the Food Policy Council and why it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't disagree. And I think that, to me, I like the summit example because that was the first time I think I had seen that scale. And I've heard from other communities the same thing, like they've never had something at that scale in their community. And I see it as something we can use with different topics. So let's do a food security summit, invite the right stakeholders into the room and have those conversations. And maybe, right now we're really focused at homelessness, and I think we need to be, but hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll have, other opportunities to focus on some of our biggest issues. So that's what I'm hoping for next.
I agree with you, but a lot of the food bank research in the last couple of years have shown that 65% of the people that are coming to the food banks across Ontario would be homeless if it wasn't for the food banks supplying them the food. That's how close we are to having more people be homeless, even at the time that we look like we're approaching it directly. And it's because the whole food and shelter thing are interrelated. They cannot be separated. And so I hope that the food side of it gets more attention as well, because I think the homeless thing will suffer without that. I think that's important. Skylar, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I know we got budget time coming up, and you've got your stuff that you're all doing, but maybe in a few months before the summer we can talk again, because I'd like to see what you think the progress is and how it's going, and we can keep sharing notes. But I want to thank you personally for approaching the food bank in the way that you did, and to try to get your own input in about food security, but also hear others' assessment as well. I think that's the best of politics and the best of citizenry. I think that's really great. Thanks for this, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.
Good.